guys, hope all is well. It's been a while since I brought a video to you all, but I wanted to get back into it. A lot has changed since the last time I did one of these. I've moved. I moved to Brooklyn. Still working at the same job, but I think more importantly than all these things is actually I got my first GM norm, which was a really probably the greatest achievement of my life to date, at least in chess, but I think probably just in general. It was a really big deal. I'm really happy about it. I'm at my peak rating chess-wise, and I think it's a little bit tough. It's a bit of a tough tug of war to essentially do the chess-related instruction and teaching and focus on your own game. But I'm going to try and find a delicate balance here. Anyways, going into this video, I was thinking, well, what is something I sort of can get in sort of maybe a daily grind of doing? And I know I've said daily videos before. Sometimes it's difficult to do that. But I did want to do something that was sort of like a game of the day type of thing. Because even on days when I'm not focusing heavily on chess, I look at a few games I flip through, and I just try to find something that stands out. So instead of that being a private activity, today I'm just going to show you a game I looked at that really stood out to me for today. And this will be the first game of the day, if you will, in hopefully an extended series of such videos. So this game comes from the Swiss Championship. Yannick Pelletier, he's been around for quite a while. He's a Swiss GM. He sometimes commentates at the Biel event and is rated 2551. And he was white against a guy named Roland Ekstroem, rated 2381. The other thing that I want to note that was a pretty significant deal about this game is that, Yannick was born in 1976, and Ekstroem was born in 1956. So not only is there almost a 200-point discrepancy in their ratings, Black is also like 20 years older and is not like one could say is probably not at their peak anymore chess-wise. I just thought it was a really well-played game. So anyways, I'm going to get into it. So d4, knight f6, and actually I'm going to flip this board really quickly because I think that'll actually be a little bit helpful for us because we want to look at the black side here. So d4, knight f6, Roland was black. Knight f3, d5. Sort of looks like there might be a Slav on the horizon with c4, but Yannick went bishop f4, and this move, I must say, has been played ad nauseum these days, the London system. Part of the reason for that is it allows, at least in theory, to sidestep a lot of main lines and just get a position. The thing is, even the side lines become main lines when they're played as much as they're played these days. So, actually in the last round of the tournament I played in to get my first GM norm in early June, I was on the black side of the London system, and I didn't expect the line, but everyone has to have something against the London system these days because it's actually really popular. Anyways, so bishop f4, c5. That's really probably the most aggressive move against the London, just trying to attack the center right away. e3, knight c6, and knight b2. I actually like this move order for white of the London system. You could also consider playing pawn c3 here, but I think it cuts out some options. And a lot of times white may want to play pawn c4 and break open the center. So I actually do think knight bd2 is the most flexible line. I've played this myself. There's a line I won with white once where when like queen b6, d takes c5, queen takes b2, rook b1, and I think it was queen c3, and I went bishop b5. And I won a nice game in this line once. I think white is supposed to be slightly better in this position by virtue of just being a little bit more developed, closer to castling, and the rook has this nice b5 to work with. And even though white's pawn structure, you could say, is shattered on c2 and a2, it's not as big a deal as you might think. It's not such a big deal. So anyways, that's a little bit of Lenin theory. You can consider looking at it on your own time. So that's not what happened. So I'm going to go back. And after knight b2, queen b6 did happen. But after d takes c5, queen takes b2 is the critical move. Black went for queen takes c5. And with this move, I think white is definitely a little bit better. Part of the reason for that, again, is because, well, black has wasted 2 tempi going from d8 to b6 to a5, to c5, excuse me. That's so 2 moves there. And again, white is a little bit closer to developing and castling. So I think white's a little bit better here. a3 was played. It's a little bit of a prophylactic move. Teeing up for b4, maybe guarding the square for some checks at some point, because I think white really wants to play c4 in a lot of these positions, and maybe I don't know, but maybe black was a little bit worried about, white was a little bit worried about like a capture and then like a queen b4 check. I don't buy it, but I'm just sort of reasoning here that maybe that was what black was thinking about, or what white was thinking about. So anyway, a3 is played. A little bit tepid for my taste, but teach their own. And yeah, and then I think this move actually gives black the opportunity to sort of catch up development-wise and play bishop g4, which is a move I think is pretty decent. The point being that you just get the bishop outside of the chain before you play e6. I mean, if white could have also played e6 here, but then this bishop is sort of locked behind the pawns for quite a while. So I think it was an interesting choice. So bishop g4, white played h3, and black sort of took this this knight very quickly, just bishop takes f3. And I don't love that decision, frankly. If you've watched me commentate before, you know I'm a pretty serious advocate of the 2 bishops, and this is just giving them up. So, I mean, the real question is, if bishop h5, is there serious consequences to that with g4? I don't really think so. I think g4, bishop g6, and I mean, black is already attacking c2. So I don't actually think there's any major consequences here. And I think it would have just been much smarter to keep the tension. I think this is something that a lot of players struggle with, actually, is keeping the tension in certain positions. Just really important to do so. So anyways, that didn't happen. Bishop takes f3 happened. Knight takes f3 is the most natural. And pawn g6. And, okay, so the contours of the position are almost set. I'm going to go a few more moves just so we take a look. So bishop b2, bishop g7, developing, castles. And now the contours are sort of set. Essentially, white has the 2 bishops, but black has more space in the center with their pawns to date, right? And the reason I say that is because the white pawn is on d5 and is the only pawn on the 4th or 5th ranks. So white has a touch more space at this juncture. There may be a position down the road where this isn't necessarily the case, because white may consider playing pawn c4 or breaking. But if white does not break in the middle with a move like pawn c4, like that, you can imagine that black might be better. Oh, yeah. I'm trying to get rid of that highlight. Yeah. So you can imagine that black could be better, and which is a little bit strange to say, but space is the asset that black has right now. Now, the asset that white has is the 2 bishops. So we'll see over time how these advantages sort of play out. The other thing I want to note is black's bishop is really well placed in this diagonal. Like, that's a really awesome diagonal. So this we'll see what plays out. So c3 happened. c3, essentially the idea, I guess, is to cut the bishop on the long diagonal, not allow it that scope. I sort of disagree with that move a little bit. I'm wondering if maybe there was a better way than to just hold put. Like maybe a move like rook c1 with the idea to go c4. I think it's really imperative to break open the center for the 2 bishops. So that's sort of what my thought process is. I think c3 is just a little, it's not a bad move, but it's just a little bit solid, passive. I don't know. All right, queen b6, going back. I think that's a good move. Also, eyeing the b2 pawn and getting the queen out of the way of any potential b pawn b4 ideas that might have happened. So, decent idea there. And rook b1, defending that pawn. Another thing that's nice about queen b6 is that it prevented white from going queen b3, which was definitely a possibility. So, rook fd8. Okay, that's another nice, very nice move. The point is that, again, white wants to play c4 to liberate the center and start to play in the middle with the two bishops. But rook d8 just prevents that, because now if c4, the rook is eyeing the queen on that line. So that's a thing. So rook fd8, queen a4. Okay, makes sense, getting the queen off that line. Rook ac8 also makes sense to me, because c4 again is this break that white will want to play, and black is teeing up the rooks to eye down these lines. So that makes sense to me. And yeah, I think again, if white does not get in the c4 break, black will be totally fine, because black has adequate control of the center, and this knight controls a nice square on e4, and who knows, maybe this knight will control a square on c4. So Yannick made an interesting decision here. I don't think it was necessarily I don't think it's necessarily necessary to rush this here. I would have actually considered a move like rook fd1 here, just sort of keeping the tension a little bit, preparing c4 a little bit more. Yannick thought it was imperative to trade the queens right away, and I sort of disagree with that decision. He played queen b5. The reason I disagree with that decision is because, was it necessary? I mean, I like to trade queens just as much as the next person. Once you trade queens, it's a lot harder to get off the c4 break, because you're not going to have as much coverage on that square. So after queen b5, queen takes b5, bishop takes b5, knight a5, which I think is an excellent move. Again, now it's not really clear to me how white is going to get to play c4 or e4. Both these pushes seem pretty impossible. So, yeah, I mean, I think white is still fine here, but again, now black clearly has the space advantage in the middle, and these pawns are not going to be, these white pawns are not going to be easily pushed. And I always like to say, no pawn break, no plan. So think about that phrase as we move toward further along in this game, that there isn't really a great pawn break here for white. Because again, e4 is not possible, c4 is not possible, and if you move the b pawn anywhere, you're just weakening the c3 square. So a lot of problems here. So rook fd1. Again, this is the move I thought should have been played with the queens on the board, but okay. Knight c4. I'm not so sure knight c4 is necessary. I mean, you don't necessarily have to occupy square to control it. I think the knight was doing just fine on a5, controlling this. I would have opted for. I would have played a different move. I would have considered a move like pawn e6, or maybe knight e4 like that. I don't know. I just would have done something. I would have slow played a little more. Even a6 actually is a solid move, just kicking the bishop back. But knight c4 is not bad. Knight c4, it just sort of, I thought, forces white's reply knight e5, challenging that knight, getting it out of the way. And after knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, knight e4 happened. And here's another really interesting position, because black still has the space in the middle of the board, and I mean, frankly, white's bishops haven't really done anything yet. And if these bishops are traded off, then there isn't even a bishop pair, right? There's just a bishop versus a knight, but this knight on e4 versus this bishop on b5, this knight is so active, it's hard to imagine anything really bad happening. Another thing I want to point out is that the bishop retreats, let's say to h2. there is this move, bishop takes c3 in the air. I don't know if it works, but I was just thinking like b takes c3, knight takes c3, and then these rooks are hit, and I don't know. I'm not so sure it works or not, but it's just something that you have to consider. And I mean, normally two bishops are better than the rook, but if black gets a few pawns forward, it can be a little bit tricky. It would be tough to evaluate this position properly. I think white should be fine. If black only had one pawn, I'd say white is just better. But here, I don't know. It's just tough to say. Now, again, I'm not using an engine for this analysis. These are just my personal impressions as I go through a game. This is what I do every day, or almost every day. I look at a few games, think about them, think about the decisions that were made, and try to rationalize what happened. And then I might verify later. But I think this is how you get better. You go through games, you try to understand and see what's happening, what's going on. So, in lieu of some of these ideas in the middle, and I guess this bishop was on g7 was becoming a little bit annoying, because the other thing was that if the bishop moves back, there's still no pawn break for white. c4 is not going to; it's just going to serve to help this bishop. And yeah, so bishop takes g7 was played, king takes g7, and wow, I think one could definitely say black's position is better than it was 10 moves ago, for sure. I think, I mean, black has a king that's actually a little bit closer to the center than white's. Black has better control of the center, has more space with his d5 pawn, just eyeing the e3 and c3 pawns. And this knight it has some nice squares to work with, whether it be c5 or d6, and they're all good for different reasons. Like the knight going to c5 and then b3, that might be a nice holes to massage. Also, the knight could go to d6, where from d6 it eyes both the e4 square and the c4 square. So a lot of things to like about black's position. And you already have to start to think, okay, it's probably still around equal, but where's this bishop going to be the most useful? Because it's not really very useful on b5 right now. I would consider maybe the bishop being most useful on f3, like just relocating on this diagonal. But again, it's really tough. And I guess white agreed, because white played bishop e2, trying to get it to a more reasonable square. The other thing to point out was that if white played pawn c4, this bishop would be sort of cut off from the action and couldn't go back. So black would be able to play a6, and that would be a little problematic, because the bishop would have to move, and black would just win a pawn. So bishop e2, e6, a very nice move. A little bit counterintuitive for people that maybe don't have a ton of chess experience, but a lot of times they teach you keep your pawns on the opposite color of the opposing bishop. That can be true in a lot of situations, but there are many other situations where you actually want to keep your pawn chain on the same color as the opposing bishop to restrict the scope of that bishop. So the point of having this chain like h7, g6, f7, this whole chain to d5, is that once this bishop does get to this diagonal, it's sort of biting on granite. That's the phrase I like to use. It's not really hitting anything critical. So as a consequence of that reality, the bishop on f3 won't even be that useful, because I'm going to move the arrows now, but the knight, again, if the bishop goes to f3, this knight will drop back to d6, and it'll be eyeing with the critical squares. So interesting nuances to think about. So rook d4 was played, and it's clear that Yannick was not really impressed with his position here. Bishop f3, not really a move. I think now white was maybe trying to play for c4 or transferring the rook on the fourth rank. Knight f6 back, interesting. I would have preferred knight d6 in my opinion. Again, I think this move just covers everything. It eyes this square, eyes this square. Knight f5 is a possibility, although it doesn't really do anything just yet. Also protects b7. I think the knight was perfectly placed on d6. And the other thing there is that if white ever does go c4, if white does try to manage c4, then knight f5 and pawn d4 comes with tempo, and the c4 pawn might just be blocking its own bishop on the diagonal. I know that was a mouthful, but essentially black has a little bit more space here, and I think can take some liberties to, take advantage of that. All right, so knight d6 was not played. Knight f6 was played. Rook bd1, and now the threat from white is actually c4, because this rook, these rooks are doubled up against the rook on d8, so d takes c4 is out of the question, and for that reason, Roland played rook e8, which makes sense to me. Rook a4 was played. Note that c4 is not impossible anymore because of pawn e5, and then the rook would have to go back, and then d takes c4 would happen. So I'll actually show that without arrows. So c4, e5, rook back, and then takes, and black would just be down. White would just be down a pawn for no reason. So that's why c4 is not possible. So white shifted plans and played rook a4, attacking the pawn. But again, it's hard to make these renegade rook moves work when there aren't any other, when you don't have any other pieces involved. So it's very easy to defend this. So a6, pretty simple to defend that. And after rook b4, just rook e7. Again, very easy to defend these simple attacks. They're not really doing anything. I will say again, this knight would have been better on d6. There would have been no need to defend this way. You would have also been controlling the c4 and e4 breaks. Now the white knight is just controlling the e4 one. And in this position, I think white should have considered maybe bailing out, because frankly, white hasn't had many gains, and this might be one of the only moments that c4 is actually possible. Because here c4 happens, and the bishop might get a new diagonal to work with once this opens up, and you could trade some pieces, and it's hard to imagine there being any significant advantage for black. Instead, white played a4, and again, there's no pawn breaks. The pawn breaks will actually result in pieces being opened up, and this doesn't do that. Now I understand that white's trying to fix the structure, but I think c4 really should have been played. So a4, rook c5, just stopping a5. Rook a1, trying to play a5 anyway. The point is that when the pawn's on a5, it fixes these pawns on light squares. So it makes some sense, but I don't know. Rook ec7 was played, stopping c4 once and for all. a5. And a5 is sort of a double-edged move. The reason I say it's double-edged is because although it restricts the pawns on a7 and a6 and b7, what it also does is it makes it something that white has to defend. So this a5 pawn needs constant attention, and it's tough to say which pawn might be weaker, the a5 pawn or the b7 pawn, given how extended the a5 pawn is. Knight e4, rook b6, and it's funny, he's trying to get his knight back to d6, like I said a few moves ago, but it's just nice if it would have been on d6 all along, right? King f8, trying to get that knight to d6. Bishop d3, white's saying, I'm going to threaten to take and not let your knight get to d6. So knight back. Rook b4, king e7, and f4. And f4, I think, is a real mistake. I don't know if Yannick was in time trouble or what was happening, but f4 totally weakens the pawn structure for white. For one, this e3 pawn is a weakness for the rest of the game, and it's not really clear what f4 accomplished. I mean, black wasn't necessarily trying to play e5 anyway, because if you played e5, the d5 pawn would have been weakened. So I don't think that was really the intent anyway, and I don't know, it's not correct to me. All right, so the other thing that's wrong with f4 is what happened next. which was this move h5. And the point of h5 is now you get to fix these other pawns in a very uncomfortable manner. And, there have just been weaknesses made. This f4 move weakened these squares, these dark squares, and black can consider playing h4 and fixing the pawns on the king side. So I think f4 is a real mistake and just a serious blunder. So king f2 was played. If I was black in this position, I would have played h4 and just fixed these pawns right away. Because if, let's say, g3 happens, or even g4, I'll just take en passant, and then this pawn will be isolated and weak. So that's what I would have done. And then I would have shifted my rook back around to the h file. So I would have gone rook c6, rook d6, rook d8, h8, and tried to massage the weaknesses a little bit. That did not happen, actually. Instead, Roland played knight e8, which makes a lot of sense. We talked about this knight wanting to come to d6 somehow. Finally, Roland started to figure out, okay, the knight is best placed on d6. It's defending everything. It's covering the right squares, and it leaves my rooks free to roam. The one thing about knight e8, though, is that g4 is now an option, which wasn't an option before. Strangely enough, though, e4 was played, and I guess e4 makes some sense because you're giving scope to the bishop, but black doesn't have to take on d5. I understand if e takes d5, bishop takes e4, or if d takes e4, bishop takes e4, and knight d6, we go here and bishop f3. This is sort of a victory for white because now this bishop has permanent scope against this pawn on b7, and it's really hard to imagine white being worse here at all. But if that bishop does not get transferred over, it's tough to say whether it was good or not. And that's why I really like this next move, knight d6. Point being is that this bishop is not going to get transferred over to right diagonal. It's not necessary for this to happen. And then e takes d5 happened. Rook takes d5. And again, you see now this bishop can't transfer over to e4 because if bishop e4, then just knight takes, and rook d2 check, picking off the b2 pawn with the winning position. So after rook takes d5, king e3 was played. And now bishop fe4 is a real possibility, and I like what black did here, playing knight f5 check. Because now this king is the only thing defending this bishop on d3, and it can sort of be harassed by the knight on g3, and this rook can go to d7. And I think black sort of has taken over the initiative a little bit here. And after bishop takes f5, which was played by Yannick, g takes f5, there's a real weakness on g2 because this pawn break is not possible. Note that this weakness on g2 would not be as significant a weakness if this pawn was not back on f2, where it should have been. This f4 move really weakened the black position. Because if the pawn was on f2, white could just go g3, and it would just be protected by this pawn on f2, like that. So, all right. So white does have an extra pawn on the queen side, but the thing is that it's not actually very easy to cover, to sort of push the majority, because again, this a5 pawn needs constant attention, and frankly, black controls the d file already, and black has a few nice plans. Black could go rook c d7 and then push on the d file. Black can consider pressuring the g2 pawn, and I don't know, it's just a slightly better position for black. So c4 was played. I really don't love that move because now this rook is blocking its own connection to the king side, but desperate times, I guess. Rook dc5, attacking the c4 pawn. King d4, and now f6. f6 is a really, really nice move. Just trying to get the majority going, trying to push e5 makes a lot of sense. And again, these rooks are so clumsy and cut off from the action right now. So rook e1 happened because e5 was a real dangerous threat, but now white's it looks like black's just winning a pawn. Rook takes a5 check, or not check, but rook takes a5. Okay, rook b6, I guess the idea to hit e6. e5 check, f takes, and rook d7 check. And this is something that that clearly Yannick must have missed. He must have missed that black actually gets to keep the extra pawn by playing take on e5 next, because once the king moves away with king c3, rook takes c5, black actually kept the extra pawn, and the one that was on e6 didn't just get gobbled up by this rook. Now, very important to note that this move would have been a real mistake, f takes e5, because of b4, and this rook would not have been able to defend the e5 pawn, and then all of a sudden white would be better. So rook takes e5, but a pawn, even though these are double pawns, a pawn is a pawn. So rook takes, f takes. You might be wondering, why didn't white just move the rook away? Why did he help undouble the pawns? Well, the reason for that is maybe because if rook f1, maybe white was a little bit worried about this rook having free reign on this file. Maybe rook e3 check was a possibility. That's my best guess. Now that I look at it, though, I do prefer rook f1. I think rook takes e5 is probably a mistake, because it's much harder to defend with one rook and a protected passed pawn. So rook takes, f takes, and now this pawn is just marching. Rook h6. Honestly, this pawn on h5 is not really of much consequence, so e4 was played. Rook takes h5. King e6. Very important to play king e6, because if you did some sort of lazy move, let's say like a5, rook h7 check would be really problematic. Black does not want to trade these rooks right now. So black wants to use this rook to cut off the white king from getting back into the game. So that's why the rooks need to stay on the board, and king e6 does just that, allowing for the rooks to stay. Rook h6, king e5, and again, this wayward pawn that white went for on the king side doesn't matter. In endgames, a lot of times the strongest pawn is the furthest up the board. So, and right now the strongest pawn is the e4 pawn. It's marching on home down the yellow brick road, we could say. Rook g6, e3, just marching. Rook g8, king f4. And this is problematic. Rook e8, trying to finally get the rook behind the pawn, but now rook g7, a really nice transfer, essentially just trying to pick up a pawn and keep the e3 pawn. And note that if king d3, which might have been the desired move in certain positions, I don't think it works. Why doesn't it work? I think it doesn't work because just rook takes g2, and if rook takes e3, there might be a few moves, but the one, I mean, you could take on b2, but the one that stands out to me is maybe just rook g3, actually. And the point is actually that white has to trade, and this pawn is marching up the board really quickly, and black gets to pick off the h3 pawn. So, for instance, if h4, okay, black could just take it and then come back and still protect f5. But if king e3, not taking on h3, black would not do that, but play f4 check. And after king e2, king g2, and there's no way to stop this pawn from marching to the promised land. So with that in mind, it's just the end games now are even bad for white, so not really good. So because of that, g4 is played, and black played a brilliant move, because you could take here, but this makes the task really difficult, because now white has the f file to check with, and then the king can come over and support the action. Now, a lot of these endgames, what you're able to do is you're able to use pawns to shield the king from checks, and that's why king f3 is super strong. The point is that if g takes f5, which happened, well, I'll show another line first. The first thing is that if king d3, rook d7, check, and now that there's opposition, the king just has to go back, and then black can just push this pawn and go king f2 and queen. Oops, I went ahead a little bit. Now the other issue is if you go like, I don't know, king d4. Well, rook d7 check also works, but even rook d7 check still works. There's nothing to talk about here. Just forcing the king back. And again, there's no shield. If rook f8 happens, now black can just go f4 and shield, and the pawns are really nice shields for the king. So just game over, actually. And king f3 is a really nice bit of finesse that I think Yannick must have been like, oh my god, I didn't see that. So anyway, g takes f5 happened, but now e2, king d4, rook d7 check, king c5, and king f2. And it was game over. Just like that, this king made it all the way up the board. The black pawn was the furthest passed pawn, you could say, and the activity there led to the victory. Now, I think when I'm looking at this game and I think about it, like the real big key for me was the tug of war between the slight bit of space advantage that black had and the two bishops that white had. And white was never actually able to make the two bishops a real asset in this game. So why didn't white make the two bishops an asset? Well, I think part of it is white actually traded the queens a little bit too quickly. And white didn't actually get a pawn break in that was good and effective. In the opening, the pawn break that should have been tried was c4. And given that c4 never happened, the pawn stayed on e3 and c3, and black was a little passive. So, or white was a little passive. So just thinking about that when you're playing chess, about where your pawn breaks are, what are the advantages, two bishops and stuff, those are good things to think about. And I think it was a really, really well-deserved victory for Roland. 20 years older, in his early 60s. Yannick is in his early 40s and 200 points lower. Who knows? Rating and age really are just a number. All right, well, I'll let you guys go. I hope you enjoyed that recording, and have a good one.